The rain wasn't just falling, it was a physical assault. A cold, relentless curtain of water that slicked the asphalt of the downtown Los Angeles alley and turned the grime into a running stream of black sludge. It hammered against the metal lid of a dumpster, creating a frantic, irregular drumbeat that accompanied the only other sound in the narrow space. The desperate, rhythmic pump and whoosh of air being forced into a lifeless body. Sarah Jenkins was on her knees, her scrubs soaked through, the cheap fabric clinging unpleasantly to her skin. Her world had shrunk to the space directly beneath her hands. The sternum of the woman on the ground, a woman with a face like a crumpled paper bag and clothes that smelled of wet decay and misery, was the center of her universe. Push, release. Push, release. 30 compressions, then 2 breaths, her mouth covering the woman's through the thin barrier of a CPR mask she kept in her backpack. The flashing red and white lights of the ambulance had already vanished from the alley's mouth, their sirens' wail fading into the cacophony of the city. The paramedics had been there for all of 4 minutes. Sarah had watched them from the entrance to the staff parking garage, her shift over, her body screaming for sleep. They'd done a cursory check, a flash of a penlight and unreactive pupils, a brief palpation for a pulse that wasn't there. Transient DOA, likely OD, she'd heard one of them mutter to the other before they'd packed up their gear. Case closed. But as they walked away, Sarah saw it. A flicker. A single, almost imperceptible tremor of an eyelid on the woman they had left for dead. It might have been a trick of the strobing lights from a distant billboard, a figment of her exhausted imagination. It didn't matter, it was enough. She had sprinted into the alley, her worn-out sneakers splashing in the filthy puddles. And she had started. That was 2 hours ago. Her shoulders burned with a fire that had long since melted into a deep, agonizing ache. Her back was a column of pain. A memory surfaced, unbidden and cruel in its contrast. Her nursing school pinning ceremony. The crisp white uniform, the proud smile of her mother in the audience, the dean's voice resonating with idealistic fervor. "You are the guardians at the gate," the dean had said, "the watchers in the night. You are the line between hope and despair." Sarah let out a bitter, choked laugh that turned into a grunt of effort. Push, release. Some guardian. She was on her knees in a garbage-strewn alley, trying to resuscitate a ghost while the city ignored them both. "Come on," she whispered, her voice raw. The words were for the woman, for herself, for the uncaring universe. "Don't you dare. Don't you dare give up on me. You hear me? We're not done." This was no longer just a medical procedure. It had transcended protocol and become something primal. It was a battle of wills, her stubborn, furious compassion against the cold, clinical finality of death. She could feel the woman's ribs groaning under the pressure, a sickening crunch that would have made a textbook-wielding instructor cringe. But she could also feel a strange, fierce energy, a refusal to let go. Finally, after an eternity of compressions and breaths, a new sound pierced the rhythm of the rain. A siren, growing closer. The second ambulance, the one she had screamed for over the phone, arguing with the dispatcher who'd kept repeating, "Ma'am, a unit has already cleared that scene." It wailed its reluctant arrival, its headlights cutting through the darkness and illuminating the desperate tableau. One woman fighting for a life that the world had already written off. The emergency room of Los Angeles Public Hospital was its usual Tuesday night war zone. A controlled chaos of beeping machines, hurried footsteps, and the low moans of people in pain. The paramedics who had brought Eleanor in were visibly annoyed, their movements brusque. They saw a waste of time, a disruption to their flow. They wheeled the gurney into the trauma bay with a perfunctory shove. They were met by Officer Miller, a cop with a neatly trimmed mustache and an air of bored authority. He'd been called to the scene after Sarah's frantic call, and his expression made it clear he considered the whole affair a nuisance. He looked from the unconscious woman on the gurney to Sarah, who stood dripping and trembling beside it. "Ma'am, the first team are professionals," he said, his tone laced with condescension. "They are trained to make these calls. Sometimes, in these cases, nature has to take its course." "I'm a professional too," Sarah shot back, her exhaustion giving her words a sharp edge. "I'm an RN. I saw a sign of life and I acted on it. She has a pulse because I kept it going." Officer Miller just shook his head slowly, as if dealing with a particularly stubborn child. The ER's attending physician, Dr. Evans, swept into the bay, his white coat a pristine shield against the messiness of his profession. He was a man in his 50s with tired, cynical eyes that seemed to have seen every form of human suffering and grown weary of all of them. He barely glanced at the woman on the gurney. "What do we have?" he asked, his attention already on the chart. "Jane Doe," the paramedic recited, "found down in an alley. Another RN on scene initiated CPR, claims for 2 hours." Dr. Evans' eyes flickered towards Sarah for a half-second, a flicker of dismissal. "Jane Doe, no ID, track marks?" he asked, not waiting for an answer. His gaze was already scanning the crowded ER. "Another one. Find a hallway to put her in until social work can figure it out." The casual cruelty of it hit Sarah like a physical blow. "Doctor," she began, her voice shaking with a mixture of fatigue and fury. "I was there for 2 hours. I kept her alive. She showed signs of—" "Nurse," Dr. Evans cut her off, his voice flat and final. "You did your job. You brought her here. Now let me do mine. We have 20 other patients who actually have a chance. Your involvement is over." He turned and walked away, already focused on the next case, leaving Sarah standing in a puddle of rainwater and indignation. The system hadn't just been indifferent, it had looked her in the eye and told her she was wrong to care. Her shift had been over for 3 hours, but Sarah couldn't leave. The woman, this Jane Doe, had been moved from the chaos of the ER to a curtained-off bay in an overflow corridor. She was a piece of human driftwood washed up on the shore of the hospital, waiting for the tide of bureaucracy to pull her away again. Sarah pulled a stool to the bedside. The woman's face, now free of the street's grime, was still a roadmap of hardship, but there was a fineness to her bone structure that was visible beneath the puffiness and bruises. Sarah took a warm, wet cloth from a basin and began to gently clean the woman's hands. It was a small act, a quiet protest against the institutional dehumanization she had just witnessed. She cleaned the dirt from beneath the woman's broken fingernails, the grime caked into the lines of her palms. As she carefully wiped the woman's left wrist, her fingers brushed against something, a slight, raised pattern in the skin. Puzzled, she looked closer. There, faded by years of sun and neglect but still unmistakable, was a tattoo. It was a delicate, intricate design, a 5-pointed star intertwined with the stem of a single blooming rose. It was a mark of elegance and intention, a secret symbol that was utterly at odds with the life of the woman who bore it. Sarah stared at it, a shiver running down her spine. Who was she? Emotionally and physically drained, she knew she had to go home. She stood up, her joints protesting. She looked down at the still, silent face on the pillow one last time. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I wish I could do more." As she turned to leave, she felt a flicker of movement. She looked down. The woman's fingers, which had been limp and lifeless, twitched. Then, slowly, weakly, they curled around Sarah's hand. It wasn't a reflex, it was a grasp, a frail, desperate connection in the vast, lonely silence. Tears welled in Sarah's eyes. It was a silent thank you. A silent plea, "Don't leave me." A soft voice came from behind her. "That's why we do it, kid." Sarah turned to see Maria, a veteran nurse with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, standing there holding a fresh IV bag. Maria had seen everything in her 30 years at LA Public, and her cynicism was tempered with a deep well of compassion. She nodded toward the linked hands. "For moments like that," Maria continued, her voice soft, "don't let bastards like Evans burn it out of you. You did a good thing tonight. A very good thing." In that moment, holding the hand of a nameless woman in a forgotten corner of a hospital, Sarah knew her fight had just begun. The tattoo was a clue. The grasp was a promise. This was no longer just a patient. It was a mission. A week later, Sarah found herself in an environment far more sterile and intimidating than any operating room. The office of the hospital administrator, Mr. Harrison. The room was a study in corporate gray and polished mahogany. Harrison himself, a man in a perfectly tailored suit with silver hair and a humorless smile, sat behind a large, empty desk. Dr. Evans stood near the window, his arms crossed, a silent and smug co-conspirator. During the past week, Sarah's life had been consumed by Jane Doe. She spent her breaks and the hours after her shifts at the woman's bedside. She talked to her, read to her from novels she picked up at the thrift store, and played classical music on her phone. She had become the woman's unofficial guardian, her only advocate, and now she was being punished for it. "Nurse Jenkins," Mr. Harrison began, his voice smooth as polished stone, "your commitment to this patient is noted." The word hung in the air, weighted with disapproval. However, the hospital has absorbed the cost of this patient for 7 days. She is occupying a multi-$1,000-a-day bed. It's simply not financially sustainable. "Her name isn't this patient," Sarah said, her hands clenched in her lap. "She's a person." Dr. Evans pushed himself off the wall. "Her neurological prognosis is grim," he stated with an air of irrefutable authority. "We're talking about a persistent vegetative state. Moving her to a state-run long-term care facility is the most humane and practical solution." The name of the facility he mentioned sent a chill through Sarah. It was a place nurses called the warehouse, a place where the indigent and forgotten were sent to die quietly, out of sight and off the budget sheets. "Humane?" The word exploded out of Sarah. "You haven't looked at her, not really, not once since she came in. She squeezed my hand. She responds to my voice. And what about the tattoo? She has an identity. Have you even tried to find out who she is?" Mr. Harrison's thin smile didn't waver. "Our resources are not infinite, Nurse Jenkins. We are not a detective agency. The decision has been made. The transfer is scheduled for Friday." The cold corporate language, financially sustainable, resources, practical solution, was a wall she couldn't break through. They weren't just being indifferent anymore. They were actively trying to dispose of a human being to clear a line item on a budget, using a false prognosis as their justification. It was a quiet, bureaucratic kind of evil. That night, Sarah's small apartment was transformed into an investigation headquarters. The glow of her laptop screen cast long shadows over piles of nursing textbooks and a stack of red-lettered bills she couldn't afford to open. She was obsessed. She took a clear photo of the star and rose tattoo with her phone and began her digital quest. She uploaded the image to missing persons forums, genealogy websites, and every social media group she could find dedicated to unsolved mysteries. The post was simple and direct. "Do you know this woman? She was found in Los Angeles. She is alive and needs her name back. Please share." The responses were a deluge of noise, a few helpful suggestions, dozens of dead ends, and a smattering of cruel comments from internet trolls. The next day, she tried the official route again. She walked into Officer Miller's precinct, the photo of the tattoo ready on her phone. He recognized her immediately, his expression shifting to one of weary annoyance. "Look, miss," he said before she could even get a sentence out. "She's not missing anymore, is she? She's safe in a hospital. That's more than most people in her situation get. We have actual crimes to investigate." He refused to run the tattoo through any law enforcement databases, effectively slamming the door in her face. The system wasn't just broken, it was a fortress designed to keep people like her out. Just when she was about to give up, a notification pinged on her laptop. It was a private message on a historical society forum. The sender was an elderly woman, a retired librarian in Austin, Texas. "Young lady," the message began, "that symbol is very familiar to me. It is the crest of the Etoile Rose Society, a very exclusive, now-defunct sorority from my alma mater, the University of Texas, back in the 70s. Only a handful of women were ever initiated." It was a key, a single gleaming key. Sarah's fingers flew across the keyboard. The Etoile Rose Society, the University of Texas, the 1970s. She dove into a digital rabbit hole of university archives, old yearbooks, and digitized society pages. For hours, she scrolled through grainy black and white photos of young women with feathered hair and wide smiles. And then she found it. It was a photo from a 1974 Houston Society gala, featured in the People and Parties section of a newspaper. Standing next to a Texas senator was a young woman with a radiant, confident smile and eyes that sparkled with life. On her slender wrist, clearly visible, was the tattoo of a star intertwined with a rose. The caption beneath the photo read, Eleanor Vance. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest. A name. She had a name. A quick internet search for Eleanor Vance opened the floodgates. Vance Oil. A family fortune measured in the billions. And then the headlines from 15 years ago. Troubled heiress vanishes. Eleanor Vance's public breakdown. Family fears for mentally unstable scion. The stories painted a picture of an erratic woman who, after the sudden death of her husband, had become unstable and simply disappeared. Sarah stared at her phone screen, her world tilting on its axis. The homeless woman in the hallway, the woman they were about to ship off to die, was a missing billionaire. As she sat there in the drab hospital waiting room, trying to process the impossible truth, a shadow fell over her. She looked up. A man in a perfectly tailored $1,000 suit was standing before her. He was handsome, in his 40s, with a politician's smooth smile that didn't quite reach his cool, appraising eyes. "You must be the nurse," he said, his voice a low, confident purr. Sarah, flustered, could only nod. "I'm Arthur Vance," he said, extending a hand he didn't expect her to shake. "Eleanor's nephew, a private investigator we have on retainer monitors for any mention of the family name. You've been quite busy online." He glanced around the waiting room with an expression of faint disgust. "Thank you for finding her. The family will take it from here." His tone was polite, but the message was clear. Your role in this story is over. The meeting in Mr. Harrison's office was different this time. Sarah wasn't there. Instead, Arthur Vance and an older woman with iron gray hair and the cold, hard eyes of a hawk sat across the mahogany desk. This was Brenda Vance, Arthur's mother and Eleanor's sister-in-law. They were a formidable pair, exuding an aura of old money and absolute authority. Mr. Harrison and Dr. Evans were no longer administrators. They were supplicants. "We are, of course, immensely grateful to your hospital," Brenda began, her voice like chilled champagne. "And to the nurse, however, we are also concerned." She paused, letting the word hang in the air. "This nurse, Miss Jenkins, she seems to have formed a rather unhealthy attachment, a fixation. Given my sister-in-law's fragile mental state, which has been a problem for years, we worry about her influence." Arthur leaned forward, his expression a mask of sober concern. "She's been posting my aunt's personal details all over the internet. It's a clear violation of her privacy. Frankly," he lowered his voice, "and it seems like she might be after a payday. A woman like my aunt is a target for opportunistic people. We need to protect her." It was a masterful performance. They played on the hospital's deepest fears, litigation and scandal. They painted Sarah not as a hero, but as an unstable, emotionally overwrought subordinate who had crossed professional lines. For Harrison and Evans, it was an easy choice. Siding with the Vances meant the Jane Doe problem was solved, and they were ingratiating themselves with a powerful, wealthy family. The next time Sarah tried to visit Eleanor's room, she was stopped by a hospital security guard. He was polite but firm. "I'm sorry, Miss Jenkins," he said, avoiding her eyes. "But by order of the family and the administration, you are no longer permitted to have contact with this patient." Sarah was stunned. "But I'm her nurse. I'm the one who, Your nursing supervisor has been informed," the guard said, cutting her off. "You're to stay away from this floor. They said something about a lawsuit if you don't comply." It was a smear campaign, executed with brutal efficiency. Her compassion had been twisted into obsession. Her advocacy was now harassment. They were erasing her from the story, stealing her connection to Eleanor, and using their power to turn the very institution she worked for against her. The injustice of it was a hot, choking rage in her throat. Devastated, defeated, and furious, Sarah knew she couldn't obey. She had to see Eleanor one last time. She had to let her know that she hadn't just abandoned her. That night, she used her ID badge to take the service elevator to Eleanor's floor, her heart pounding with every ding of the lift. She crept down the darkened hallway, past the slumbering nurse's station, and slipped into the room. Eleanor was asleep, her breathing soft and regular. The flickering lights of the city outside cast moving shadows on the wall. Sarah pulled a chair to the bedside, the same one she had sat in countless times over the past week. She took Eleanor's hand. It felt warm, familiar. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and bitter. "Eleanor," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Your name is Eleanor. I'm so sorry. They won't let me see you anymore, but I need you to know you aren't alone. I won't forget you." At the sound of her name, a name she likely hadn't heard spoken with kindness in 15 years, Eleanor's eyelids fluttered. They opened. The pupils were no longer hazy and unfocused. They were clear. They locked onto Sarah's face. There was a flash of lucidity, of dawning recognition. And then another emotion flooded them, an emotion so powerful it made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. It was pure, unadulterated terror. Eleanor's fingers tightened around Sarah's hand, a desperate, convulsive squeeze. Her mouth opened, but only a dry, rasping sound came out. She was trying to warn her. The door clicked open, bathing the room in the harsh light from the hallway. Arthur Vance stood there, his arms crossed. A cruel, triumphant smirk played on his lips. He had been waiting. He had known she would come. "Touching," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "I had a feeling you couldn't follow simple instructions." He raised his voice. "Security! Get this unstable woman out of my aunt's room. She's trespassing. I want her arrested." In that moment, everything crystallized. The game had changed. Eleanor was awake. She was a witness. But Sarah had walked straight into their trap, proving their narrative, making herself look like the obsessive stalker they claimed she was. She was ruined. And the Vances were on the verge of getting exactly what they wanted: absolute control over a terrified, silenced, and incredibly wealthy woman. The world had fallen out from under Sarah. The following 48 hours were a blur of humiliation. She was escorted from the hospital by security, her colleagues watching with a mixture of pity and fear. The next morning, she was fired via a cold, formal letter citing gross insubordination and unprofessional conduct. A restraining order was delivered by a courier that same afternoon, legally barring her from coming within 500 feet of Eleanor Vance or any member of the Vance family. She was alone, unemployed, and facing the potential loss of the nursing license she had worked so hard to earn. She was broken. It was Maria who pulled her back from the edge. Disgusted by the hospital's spineless complicity, she showed up at Sarah's apartment with a bag of groceries and a fierce look in her eye. She listened while Sarah recounted the whole nightmare, her voice hollow with defeat. "They are not going to get away with this," Maria said, her voice a low growl. "I made a call." An hour later, Sarah found herself in a cramped, cluttered office in Koreatown that smelled of stale coffee and righteous indignation. Files were stacked in precarious towers on every available surface. A young man with a shock of unruly black hair and an energy that seemed to buzz in the small space was pacing in front of a whiteboard covered in frantic scribbles. This was Ben Carter, Maria's nephew, a legal aid lawyer. Ben listened, perched on the edge of his desk, as Sarah told him the story for what felt like the 100th time. He interrupted her with sharp, pointed questions, his eyes narrowed in concentration. Sarah laid it all out. The CPR in the rain, the tattoo, Dr. Evans' dismissal, Harrison's budget sheets, the Vance's smear campaign, and finally, the look of pure terror in Eleanor's eyes. When she finished, Ben was silent for a long moment, staring at his whiteboard. "So, a broke, fired nurse with a mountain of student debt versus a billion-dollar dynasty with a team of corporate lawyers," he said finally. "It's a legal nightmare." Sarah's heart sank. It was hopeless. "But," Ben continued, turning to face her, and for the first time a slow grin spread across his face, "it's also the most beautiful case I've ever heard." He started pacing again, energized. "They aren't just trying to get rid of you. They're terrified of you. Why? Because you're the only person on the planet who sees Eleanor Vance as a human being. You're the one she woke up for. You're the one she trusts." He stabbed a finger at the whiteboard. "This isn't about money, Sarah. Not for us. This is about a soul. It's about fighting for someone who can't fight for herself. and I'll be damned if I let those slick, tailored vultures win. He stopped and looked her straight in the eye. I'll take the case. Pro bono, of course. We're going to go slay some dragons. For the first time in weeks, a flicker of hope ignited in Sarah's chest. She wasn't alone anymore. She had an ally. The first move Ben made was to file an emergency motion in probate court, petitioning for a neutral, court-appointed guardian, an attorney ad litem, to represent Eleanor's interests. He argued that the Vance family, after 15 years of absence, had a clear conflict of interest and could not be presumed to be acting in her best interest. The Vances' response was swift and brutal. Their legal team, led by a notoriously ruthless corporate lawyer named Sterling, a man with a face like a clenched fist, countersued Sarah for harassment, defamation, and emotional distress. The courtroom became the new battleground. The competency hearing was a crucible. Sterling was a master of character assassination. He put Sarah on the stand and systematically tore her life apart. "Miss Jenkins," he began, his voice dripping with false sympathy, "you have, I believe, over $100,000 in student loan debt. Is that correct?" "Yep," Sarah answered, her voice small in the cavernous courtroom. "And you work, or worked, at a public hospital for a modest salary?" "Yes." "So a young woman, deep in debt, just happens to perform a heroic act for a homeless woman who, by an incredible coincidence, turns out to be one of the wealthiest women in the country. And now you are fighting tooth and nail to insert yourself into her life. How very, altruistic." "Objection." Ben was on his feet. "Counsel is badgering the witness and assassinating her character. She's the reason Eleanor Vance is alive." "Sustained," the judge said, though his expression was weary. "Mr. Sterling, get to the point." But the damage was done. Sterling used Sarah's own compassion against her, twisting her every action into something sinister and self-serving. He portrayed her as an unstable, obsessed gold digger. The judge, an older man bound by the letter of the law, looked torn. "I'm going to need more than hearsay and good intentions, Mr. Carter," the judge said, looking down from the bench. "As of now, the family has a legal right to care for their kin. I'm not seeing enough evidence to strip them of that right." They were losing. Ben knew they needed more than just a gut feeling. They needed a smoking gun. That night, he hired Frank, a gruff retired LAPD detective turned private investigator with more sources than a city newspaper. "Dig into the Vances," Ben told him. "Everything. Finances, business deals, personal lives. Find the rot." While Frank went to work, Ben and Sarah focused on the past. They reinvestigated Eleanor's original breakdown. The media stories from 15 years ago were all sourced from family friends and unnamed sources close to the situation. It was a narrative controlled entirely by the Vances. Frank's digging paid off first. He discovered that Arthur Vance was drowning in gambling debts, owing millions to casinos in Vegas, and to even shadier offshore bookies. Brenda Vance, as the trustee of Eleanor's fortune, had been systematically embezzling funds for years, propping up her own lavish lifestyle and covering her son's losses through a series of complex and fraudulent transactions. They weren't trying to protect Eleanor, they were trying to protect their access to her money. Then came the breakthrough. Ben, acting on a hunch, tracked down a name mentioned in passing in one of the old society columns. Eleanor's former personal maid, a woman named Sophia. She was in her 80s now, living in a small, tidy home in East LA. She was terrified, her hands trembling as she held a cup of tea. It took an hour of gentle coaxing from Sarah, but finally she began to talk. The story she told was a dark, hidden tragedy. Eleanor Vance hadn't been mentally unstable. She had been trapped. Her late husband had been a violent, abusive man. After his death, when Eleanor had tried to take control of her own life and fortune, Brenda and a younger Arthur had moved to have her declared incompetent. They had paid off doctors and spread rumors. Eleanor's erratic behavior was a desperate attempt to escape their control. Her disappearance wasn't a breakdown, it was a prison break. She had chosen a life of poverty and anonymity on the streets over a gilded cage with her predatory family. The missing heiress was a fugitive, and her jailers were now petitioning a court to give them back the keys. Ben immediately filed a motion to have Eleanor moved to a neutral medical facility, away from the influence of the Vances. Citing potential financial fraud, the judge, now wary, agreed. In the quiet, sunlit room of the new facility, away from the fear and intimidation, Eleanor began to change. With Sarah by her side and with the help of a gentle, court-appointed therapist, she started to emerge from her self-imposed silence. She was still weak, her voice a fragile whisper, but her eyes were clear and intelligent. The therapist brought in a tablet with a large keyed keyboard. It was a slow, laborious process. Eleanor's fingers, stiff from disuse and arthritis, would hover over the keys, shaking slightly before tapping out a single letter. But word by word, sentence by sentence, her story began to spill out. She typed about her husband's cruelty. She typed about Brenda's threats and Arthur's greed. She typed about the doctors they had paid, the lies they had told. And then she typed the words that would blow the case wide open. They wanted to lock me away. I ran. The street was safer than home. That girl, Sarah, she saved me. I trust her. It was the emotional climax of the entire ordeal. The ultimate validation for Sarah's quixotic quest. The ultimate condemnation of the Vances. The silent victim, the woman everyone had spoken for and about, had finally found her voice. The final day in court felt like the air before a thunderstorm. Ben had submitted the new evidence. Frank's detailed report on the Vances' financial crimes, a sworn affidavit from the former maid, Sophia, and Eleanor's own powerful, typed statement. When the clerk read Eleanor's words aloud, a stunned silence fell over the courtroom. Arthur Vance went pale. Brenda's iron composure finally cracked, her face crumbling into a mask of disbelief and fury. Their lawyer, the formidable Mr. Sterling, was speechless, shuffling his papers with no argument left to make. The judge looked down from the bench, his face a mask of cold fury. He removed his glasses and looked directly at Arthur and Brenda. In all my years on the bench, he said, his voice low and dangerous, I have never seen such a craven and despicable abuse of family trust and of this legal system. You took a vulnerable, grieving woman and tried to bury her alive to feed your own greed. Then you had the audacity to try and destroy the one person who showed her a shred of human decency. His gavel came down with a crash that echoed through the silent room. Motion to appoint a neutral conservator is granted. A permanent restraining order is granted against Arthur and Brenda Vance, and I am referring this entire file, including the evidence of fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy, to the district attorney's office. I suspect you'll be hearing from them shortly. As Sarah and Ben watched, two uniformed bailiffs moved to stand behind Arthur and Brenda, waiting for them to rise. The reign of the Vances was over. 6 months later, Sarah sat on a stone bench in a beautiful, sun-drenched garden. The air was filled with the scent of roses and lavender. She was no longer wearing scrubs. She was the director of a new charitable foundation, the Eleanor Vance Project for Street Medicine, funded by a woman who knew, better than anyone, the importance of compassionate care. A motorized wheelchair hummed softly on the gravel path. Eleanor Vance, her hair now styled and her eyes bright and engaged, pulled up beside the bench. She was still frail, but the terror was gone, replaced by a quiet, resilient strength. All those years, Eleanor said, her voice still soft but clear and steady now. I thought I was invisible. I made myself invisible, and then you came along. She looked at Sarah, a small, genuine smile on her lips. You looked past all the dirt and the misery, and you saw a person. Sarah smiled back, the warmth reaching her eyes. I saw a fighter, Eleanor, she said. You fought for 2 hours in that alley. You fought your family for 15 years before that. I just gave you a little help. They sat together in comfortable silence, two women from impossibly different worlds, bound by an extraordinary circumstance. They looked out at the garden, a symbol of growth and new beginnings. Sarah's idealism, once battered and nearly extinguished, had been forged in fire and had emerged stronger, more purposeful. Eleanor, after decades of being a victim, had finally found her freedom, her voice, and a true friend. The rage and the injustice had faded, replaced by the quiet, powerful catharsis of a battle won, a life reclaimed, and a profound testament to the fact that sometimes one person's refusal to let go can, in fact, change the world.